What is a complete human? Is it a cover model? Is it a science geek? Is it a fitness expert? Or all of the above and more? Janna and Evan are crusaders that walk the earth looking at today's issues that touch our hearts and minds. The honest and hopeful outlook on the advancement of today's society. The science behind the decay of human relationships. The necessary preparations for future generations. Join us as we look deep inside ourselves and embark on a journey into becoming a complete human.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of the Complete Human Podcast with your hosts,
Janna Breslin
and Evan DeMarco. So a couple weeks ago, we dropped our podcast on our ayahuasca experience in the mountains of Peru. We had a ton of questions on that.
We got a lot of feedback on that one.
A lot of feedback.
A lot of questions, and it's obviously an interest.
It's obviously of interest. And as we start to see more and more documentaries come out about that, as you know, How to Change Your Mind hit New York Times bestseller, as we start to see more and more of a conversation about psychedelics in therapy for therapeutic benefits, we decided that we were going to go a little bit more on a deep dive on this one. So that tees up our next guest, Dr. Ingmar Gorman. Welcome.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. So I don't know if you have a specific moniker, but it kind of sounds like in all the research we could call you the psychedelic doc.
Sure. I'm a psychologist, so not to be confused with a medical doctor, but I do have a doctorate. I'm happy to say a little bit about myself. Would that be all right?
Please.
Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm a psychologist. In the world of psychedelics, I kind of wear multiple hats. One of them is currently as a co-principal investigator. So a principal investigator is somebody who runs a study. You may be familiar with MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They're a nonprofit organization that really has been a major player, and really Rick Doblin, who heads that organization, I think he deserves a lot of credit for where we are today in terms of psychedelic research. So I'm a co-principal investigator on a MAPS-sponsored study, phase 2 and phase 3 studies of MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. I had mentioned PTSD in the intro. And so I help run that site, and I'm a therapist on that site. And so that means I kind of help with the staffing. I help with all kinds of research kind of issues, data management issues that might come up. But I also see participants. We don't call them patients because it's research. So I have that contact, and I can share a little bit about that with you all. Another hat that I wear is the co-founder of a company called Fluence, and that is a psychedelic education company for mostly mental health and medical professionals. And I'd love to share a little bit more about that, but the brief kind of intro to that is that, well, as you had mentioned, there's a lot of interest now in psychedelics as therapies, but really, if you went through any kind of formal training as a mental health provider, you probably got less than an hour worth of education about psychedelics. And so what we're doing is we are kind of making up for that gap, which has implications not just for therapists and people receiving therapy, but I think there's also an element of critically viewing the drug war and various social policies that have kind of closed down conversation and even disproportionately affected certain groups in the United States due to that policy. So those are kind of the two major things that I do. I also have a private practice and have some projects here and there as well. But those are my two main focuses.
And you have a 14-month-old.
And I have a 14-month-old, yes. Yeah.
So
Another
you're a busy man.
Indeed, I am. Yeah, I try to balance it all. Luckily, where we're located, we do have daycare. And so that's really helpful. But without daycare, it was really intense. Yeah, trying to do that much work.
Believe me, I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
I've aged 47 years in the last 6 months. I'm actually 19. I just look this old.
Amazing.
So Ingmar, there's a lot of things that we want to talk about with everything that you just went through. One of the things that I'm really interested in discussing and kind of reframing, or at least letting our listeners know, is what does, as you guys get into the clinical aspects of research around some of these psychedelics, what does that do for the legal landscape?
That's a really good question. So maybe as a backdrop for people who may not know, the psychedelics, the classic psychedelics, things like psilocybin, LSD, but you may know that marijuana, cannabis also falls under this category, as does MDMA. Those are Schedule 1 compounds. Schedule 1 means that they have, by definition, a high potential for abuse and no medical use. And so that really was in the 1970s that and MDMA in the 1980s was classified under that category. And so that means obviously that it cannot be prescribed. There's currently no medical use. But as you raise this, Evan, this question, the research that's happening is sort of calling that into question. So the more evidence that we collect that shows the therapeutic potential of these compounds, there is inevitably something's going to have to happen. Either the drugs will be rescheduled, or there might be, now we're getting into the nuance of it, which is quite interesting. People are hoping that the compounds will be rescheduled, that they'll go from, say, something that's Schedule 1 to, say, something that's Schedule 2 or 3, where they can be prescribed, they have medicinal value, but they're still monitored for, they're still controlled substances. So that if somebody were to use it outside of that context or sell it illegally, there'll still be punishment for it. Fewer people are familiar with the idea, and this has happened in the past, where you would keep, say, something like MDMA as a Schedule 1 drug, but then create another name or label for that same compound and put into Schedule 3. And that would, I think, have less of a kind of impact on, say, drug policy than decriminalization might, right? So or rescheduling. So these are sort of these complex, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So as a scientist, I kind of have to say that, the data is not quite in yet, even around MDMA or psilocybin. We have initial data that shows that these could be good for certain kind of indications, but we haven't gotten past the sort of gold standard, which would be completing phase 3 clinical trials. And at that point, once we get past phase 3, something's going to have to happen around scheduling.
So that brings up something really interesting. And I kind of want to take a step back in time and look at,
Sure.
Kind of like Timothy Leary and some of the experiments that came out of Harvard. My understanding was that MDMA was originally used as like a couples therapy drug. So there's a history of therapeutic use in this. Then it becomes kind of the counterculture drugs, goes on Schedule 1. But as we start to look at the gold standard of, double-blind, placebo-controlled, all of these, does the psychedelic community have a benchmark or a litmus test that's so much higher than, shall we say, any other drug? Because as we know, set and setting becomes so essential in the use of these. So we could have a very powerful compound that by and large works for things like depression, PTSD, but in the hands of the wrong therapist, could be catastrophic. And I think that's what we saw out of the 60s with, with Timothy. So how do you guys navigate, I hate that word, but how do you guys navigate what is ultimately going to be a very tumultuous road to get hardcore clinical data that shows that these things work?
Right. Very good question. Also very nuanced. Well, so I would say, because I hear you saying multiple things. One, I just want to make clear that in terms of the standard from the medical community and the FDA, in terms of what the threshold we need to meet to see if these compounds could become medicines, they are no more stringent than they would be for any other compound. So it's not like, just to be clear, that the sort of the established regulatory bodies are saying, oh, well, because it's MDMA or psilocybin, you're going to have a harder time. That might have been true a little bit earlier on, a few decades ago or a decade ago, where the data that they were looking for to show that they were safe was they were really looking for a lot of safety data. But today, I wouldn't say that we're kind of discriminated against in any kind of way. But the question that what I heard you raise was about the psychedelics community's standard for providing the treatment. And I think that's a really important question to be asking, because the psychedelic community, being people who are I don't mean this to be derogatory in any way, but I like to say like the fans, right? They actually really like, they look into the history, they go to the conferences, as a community, they want these compounds to be shepherded in the right way. And there is a history that we don't want to repeat. And that was in the 1950s and 60s. You saw, right, so there was this first, maybe second wave of research, and there was very little regulation around these compounds. In fact, you could simply write a letter to Sandoz on the university letterhead saying that you want LSD, and they would send it to you. And so what happened, though, was that there were some people at that time, some researchers who were familiar with the idea of set and setting, and the people that they worked with, the participants, tended to do pretty well in those studies. But then there were some researchers who just thought, oh, well, this is just a pharmacological agent like any other one. You just give it to somebody who's strapped in a bed and alone, locked in a room, and it should just do its thing. And of course, people had adverse reactions to it. And so to bring up your point, Evan, as we move into the current kind of wave of research, I think it's really important that whoever is going to be working with these compounds, psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, perhaps others, that they are aware of this history and that they have the training to know how to work with these compounds so they don't kind of replicate that past, these adverse psychological reactions that are very much dependent on set and setting. So they don't, they may not come up so quickly as like blood pressure increasing, right? That's something that reliably can happen. But with these psychological effects, we really have to be more attuned to the experience.
Mm-hmm.
So to play off of that, Ingmar, I think if we look at Schedule 1 as the definition of something that has the potential to become addictive and potentially harmful, is that really true with some of these drugs? Because everything that I've read says no.
Yeah, generally, so this is psychedelics. Psychedelics, right? That comes from kind of a Greek term, or two Greek terms, mind manifesting, right? And so there are a lot of different things that can fall under that idea. So I had used earlier the term classic serotonergic or classic hallucinogens, and those are things like LSD, DMT, psilocybin. Those tend not to be addictive. They actually tend to be almost anti-addictive in some ways. Difficulty developing a tolerance to them. People don't take them in a way that they're trying to relieve withdrawal, which happens with other compounds. And the people tend to have pretty intense experiences that they don't necessarily want to be repeating on a daily basis. But the reason why I brought up the category of psychedelics is because there are what's referred to as novel psychoactive compounds, which are new derivatives or new kind of drugs that that can be ordered from Asia. I don't know if people are still doing that, but that was something that was done 5-10 years ago. And we don't know. So it's sort of the answer is, yeah, the classic psychedelics tend not to be addictive or as harmful in terms of the classic kind of drug concerns, but there are all sorts of things that could be psychedelics that could be potentially harmful. And also to define harm as not just dependence or abuse, but psychedelics do have a little bit of a harm profile around the intensity of the experience that they create. And then we have to be wary of sort of the psychological kind of composition of the person who's taking the drug, that it could be potentially overwhelming for a person psychologically. And then, of course, we should also talk about some of the physiological reactions, like I had mentioned blood pressure, right? So if somebody has uncontrolled hypertension, we don't really want them to be taking a psychedelic because they could have a cardiovascular event. Gotcha. But generally, they're compared to a lot of the different substances that are out there, they tend to be safe, but there are certain caveats there.
So if you were to have one of those pharmaceutical commercials on the TV where they have to list the side effects at the end, they would be fairly minimal in comparison to your average, restless leg syndrome drug.
Well, that is in some ways what we're identifying right now. So in the clinical trial with MDMA, we have to report every adverse event. And this is, if you ever dreamt of becoming a psychedelic researcher, you might want to reconsider it, just because of the amount of documentation that's necessary. So whenever anything happens to a participant, whether it's related to the drug or not, we have to note it down. So the classic example is a participant at home, not in the study, stubs their toe. We have to document that they stubbed their toe. And I guess if enough people stub their toe on the study, it may become that little thing that you hear in the commercial. So this is all to say that right now what we're doing is we are monitoring every single kind of reaction a person can have, whether it's directly related to the drug or being in the study or not. And that will then inform that list. And I guess it's kind of too early to say. I mean, I would like to think that they're safe, but that really the science and the evidence needs to speak to that. And it would be irresponsible for me to say otherwise at this point.
Have you seen a lot of stub toes so far?
No stub toes, no. No stub toes, but for me, maybe as a harm reduction tip for anybody out there who's considering psychedelics, often in ceremony, if you were in ceremony, or in other settings, people will lie down and they're kind of going inward. Although in ceremony, you're supposed to be sitting up, but people tend to lie down anyway. Be very careful about getting up too quickly, because these substances can increase the likelihood of fainting. And that's something that people generally don't talk about. So just as a tip out there, if you're lying down and you're doing any of this work, sit up, take your time, take a minute, then stand up if you're going to go to the bathroom. In the studies, we hold a person's arm, we make sure that they don't faint and fall and hit their head when they go to the restroom.
Our guide did that in our ayahuasca experience. And my problem is that I have a bladder the size of like a chipmunk's. And so, over the course of like 6 or 7 hours, I had to get up numerous times to use the bathroom once because I almost shat myself on her. But it was, I remember like standing up and you just feel like blood pressure drop. Like, okay, I think I can do this.
So yeah. I have a quick question about this. So when someone is engaging in psychedelic assisted therapy, is this like, what are these sessions like? I mean, does someone come to you and then you're monitoring them throughout the whole time? Is this an hour? Is it like a 5-hour thing? I mean, what does this look like when someone comes to see you or someone who's helping with this type of therapy?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot to say here. So maybe I will clarify one thing that I haven't clarified yet, which is that I've practiced two things. One, which we define as psychedelic assisted therapy, and then something called psychedelic integration therapy. Just to say a few words about psychedelic integration therapy, that's where I work in my private practice, and I also teach this to educate clinicians to help them work with people who are using psychedelics on their own. So that might be, for example, could be you two, right? You went to Peru, you had an ayahuasca experience. Say something happens, you're feeling great, or you're feeling like something is bothering you. You want to make sure that you speak to a psychologist or mental health professional who knows about psychedelics. You might contact somebody for psychedelic integration therapy to get that support around your experience and to help you integrate. Or maybe even prepare for experience if you were to do it again. What you're asking me about is psychedelic assisted therapy. This is where we actually administer, or I give somebody MDMA. And again, to really assert this happens only in research contexts at this point. There's an exception for ketamine, which we could talk about later if you like. But when we're talking about MDMA or psilocybin, and we're talking about the United States, we're talking about research contexts. And so what's that? Because it's research, that actually makes your question a little bit more complicated, because we have to do screening, we have to do informed consent, we're taking all these measures for data purposes. So I'll put that all to the side because I'm sure you may not be that interested in all of those technicalities. So when it comes to the actual sessions, the psychotherapy, so I'll speak broadly when we're talking about psilocybin or MDMA. We're usually talking about a person receiving the psilocybin or MDMA once, twice, maybe 3 times. Again, it depends on the study design, but usually in these studies, it's only 1 to 3 times.
And that would be over the course of
not
how
a drug.
long?
Over the course of, say, 3 months.
Okay.
So approximately one dosing every month. That's generally what the protocols look like. And we begin usually with 3 90-minute preparation sessions. And in these sessions, there's no drug. We're meeting maybe once a week, and we're talking about the person's history. We're talking a little bit about the drug or the placebo that they might get, because these are usually placebo studies, placebo-controlled studies. And here, this is what I think is important here is the indication, right? Because people tend to think about psychedelic assisted therapy as like one thing, but we're treating different diagnoses: depression, PTSD, alcohol use, smoking. And so I do think it's really important to the therapy to reflect what a person's working on. But after those 3 90-minute sessions, the person will have their first dosing session. Sometimes we call it an overnight session. Sometimes we call it an experimental session. There are different words for it. But those are usually 8 hours long. So a person will come in the morning. They'll check in with the therapists. Usually there are 2 therapists in the room. That's been the standard so far. And after kind of a brief check-in, a person will receive or have the choice to take the medicine, or we don't know if it's a medicine, it's a drug, or a placebo, but they'll take a pill. Mm-hmm. Now, and then they're there for 8 hours, and they kind of have to be there for 8 hours. We don't let them leave. They can withdraw from the study at any point, except during that 8 hour window. Nobody is leaving the study at that point. We don't want somebody who's under the influence, walking around Manhattan. Right. And so here, again, it depends on what kind of indication we're working with. I'll talk about MDMA and for PTSD, because that's mostly what I do. A person will, for the first about an hour to 90 minutes, MDMA, Sasha Shulgin used to say, who kind of rediscovered MDMA in the late 70s, he used to say, you can't take the A out of MDMA. People don't usually know that A is amphetamine. So it is a kind of amphetamine. And so that's a stimulant. And so for the first 90 minutes of these sessions, people tend to feel kind of anxious. And we are kind of encouraging them to relax. So they have blindfolds on, they have headphones on, they're listening to calming music. And we see at that sort of helping kind of ease them into the experience. But after the 90-minute mark, if any anxiety comes up, we see that as part of the work with the trauma. And so for the 8 hour period, people are kind of in between what we call going inward. So having the blindfolds on and the headphones on and going in. And I could talk a little bit more about why that is if you'd like. And then alternating between going in and engaging interpersonally in a therapeutic conversation with the therapists. As therapists, we're very careful about not having an agenda. The metaphor that I like is we're more like midwives to their process. We're not telling them, oh, well, you need to think about this, or this is a problem you have to figure out, or, we're not even giving interpretations or encouraging them to think about particular things. We're really there to kind of just help their own inner healing process. And then after that 8 hour period is over, they usually stay overnight. We go home, a night attendant comes in, and then the following morning, immediately in the morning, we have an integration session. So 90 minutes of processing whatever comes up, usually what came up the day before. And then you have 3 integration sessions, and then you do the dosing again. So it's sort of this alternating kind of this multi-level sandwich of 3 preparation, dosing, 3 integration, dosing, 3 integration, etc. That's what the protocol looks like at this time.
Understood.
Kind of sucks for the placebo group.
Yes.
Because right away, you're like, I didn't get the active.
Well, that is true sometimes and sometimes not. Sometimes the participants are fooled, sometimes we're fooled. Sometimes we have an active placebo or like a dose response study. So they're just getting different levels of it. So it's harder to tell. But what we found in the MDMA work for PTSD is that they're still getting all of the psychotherapy. So you could think of it as a lot of intensive therapy, and people have their symptoms reduced. So people get better just from the therapy alone, not as much as with the MDMA. Another famous psychedelic therapist and researcher Bill Richards, he says, well, just think about it as a spa day. And so it's like you get 8 hours to lay back, enjoy music. You've got these two people there who are fully attending to you. So that's another way to kind of think about a placebo.
Do you find that the participants, they are maybe more interested in this type of treatment because more of the traditional therapies weren't working for them?
Absolutely. And that is the case for both the research and for the psychedelic integration working just in private practice in the community. So it's actually really common for me to hear, and I think in some ways, research is great for evaluating a new treatment, but it tends not to be so great when it comes to what we call being representative of people who are out in the real world, right? Because it's selective. We kind of are choosing certain people to enroll. So in private practice, it's very common for me to hear people say, I've tried everything and nothing else has helped. Now that itself is something that we need to be wary of in the sense of how is a person's depression maybe or their worldview affecting that view of themselves. But I think it also speaks to a reality there that many of our treatments are insufficient in addressing the issues that people are coming in with.
Mm-hmm.
So before we get to that, and I think that that's a fascinating topic, is I'd like to discuss a little bit about the physiological effects of these psychedelics. I think, we kind of have this cultural idea that, you take something like this and then you start tripping balls. So what actually happens, whether that's MDMA or, I think LSD, and obviously some of these molecules are a little bit different, but, internally and physiologically, what is actually going on and how does that have a profound impact on these indications?
That's a great question, and I guess the short answer is we don't know exactly. So, so what you're asking about is you're asking a mechanism of action question. How does it work? And I also hear you kind of asking, particularly pointing to biology, rather than say psychology, although they're kind of intertwined. And so maybe we could narrow it down to the serotonergic hallucinogens, just because that removes MDMA, which is different. And then, so in terms of the brain, well, there are people who are looking at different areas of the brain to see what might be affected. So given their name, they work primarily through serotonin. However, there's also kind of a cascading effect in the brain, which is I'm not a neuroscientist, so this is a little bit kind of above my level of knowledge, but it's not sufficient to just say, it just works on serotonin. It works on actually quite a lot of different neurotransmitters, but the primary action is through serotonin. Currently, one way to answer that question, right now, there's a lot of interest in this construct of the default mode network. Is that something that you've talked about on your show at all, or has
we have
come up
not?
at all?
We're familiar with it, but have not discussed it on the show.
I'm actually not familiar. Okay. What does that mean?
Okay. Okay. So researchers came across this. What it means is that there are certain areas of the brain that are working in tandem together when a person is doing something. More precisely, there's something called the task activated network. And so that's when you are engaged in a particular kind of task, say solving a math problem. Your brain will light up in a particular kind of way. The default mode network is kind of the opposite of that. And so researchers came across this when they had people in brain scans, and in between asking the participants in these brain scan studies to engage in some task, they were just resting. And what the researchers noticed was when these people were at rest, there was a certain pattern of brain activity, the default mode network. And upon further investigation, they began to notice that when people are engaged in certain, because you're never not doing anything. To say that you're not engaged in any activity is not accurate, right? Because you're thinking, you're reflecting, you're maybe bringing up memories. And so this kind of introspective type of behavior is connected with the default mode network. Now, what psychedelics might be doing, there's the number of papers on this topic, particularly if anybody's out there interested in the work of Robin Carhart-Harris. He talks quite a bit about this. And the idea is that psychedelics may be, or they've observed to alter the default mode network. And so it changes and it kind of makes sense experientially. People are having a change in this interactivity of this default mode network, and they are kind of connecting. There's more maybe emotional salience to when they're reflecting on past memories. There's another idea which could be used psychotherapeutically. Another idea is around this concept of ego death. Sometimes in the kind of psychedelic community, people talk about this. This idea of where one sense of self begins to actually diminish and potentially disappear almost entirely for some period of time. And this is sometimes equated or being connects to this idea of a mystical experience. So a lot of the research around this psilocybin in particular looks at this construct of the mystical experience, this idea of self-transcendence. And that may be connected to this idea of one's ego or sense of self kind of diminishing. And then but there's still being awareness. So it's not like a person is blacked out. And with this kind of perspective, people relate to themselves, their problems, the world, society, whatever that they may be reflecting on in a different way, where they maybe they're not so confined by their previous ways of experiencing or seeing things. So that's now, there's a biological, psychological link. Yeah.
Understood. Now, is this what you were talking about going inward recently or previously? Is that what that is?
Yes. Great connection. Yeah. So very much with the psilocybin research, I was talking about MDMA, but it's also applicable for the psilocybin research. And in fact, when I was talking about the MDMA therapy and what that's like, and I had mentioned that in the session, there's interpersonal connection. We're engaging in a conversation a little bit. That actually tends to be less the case with psilocybin, because psilocybin, as you're pointing out, has there's this tendency for the mystical experience. A conversation with somebody while a person was on the psilocybin might actually interfere with their ability to go to that place that I described of the mystical experience or that ego loss. And so that is why we're encouraging them to go in and focus inward, because we think that it maximizes the likelihood of that kind of reflection.
So on that context, I read one research paper, and forgive me, this was a long time ago, but it was patients on, I think it was LSD or psilocybin, and the brain scans, what the neurologist noticed was that the people who were just coming out of this, when they're looking at brain scans, had scans very similar to those of infants. And I think what I recall, again, forgive me, because I don't know if it's lack of coffee at this point, but what they extrapolated from that is that once the ego goes away, we see the world without construct. And so then that becomes the therapeutic mechanism of action is we're not bound by that ego, that ego-driven construct of our world, and we can kind of, permeate beyond that. Is that to a certain extent kind of what we're seeing with this one? And then as we talk about, this is a two-part question, by the way, as we talk about serotonin, how do these differ than some of your SSRI, things that were, that doctors are just throwing out like M&Ms?
So the first question, that's what I maybe did not read that paper. I have not come across that analogy. I think I thought where you're going to go with it is with meditators, because there's also some sort of research that's looking at the same effect that psychedelics have on the default mode network, maybe also parallel to the effect of advanced meditators. But the analogy of the infant is a really beautiful one. Actually, Albert Hofmann, the person who synthesized LSD, would often talk about seeing the world as like a child. And I think phenomenologically, people describe seeing the world as if they were a child, seeing things new for the first time. And there's an interesting biological mechanism that I learned about once around, I think they're the NMDA receptors. So if you're sitting here talking to me now, and if there were a glass of water in the back of the room that fell over and it crashed and it shattered, you would turn around, right? Because there's And that is a process in your brain that's happening that kind of alerts you and brings your attention to something. And from one of these lectures that I attended now quite a while ago, they're talking about LSD's sort of implication in that. And so you could think about kind of that sense of awareness, that sense of interest and attention that you give to that glass that broke. But now that kind of action is kind of going on more frequently, facilitated by the LSD, to kind of maybe almost anything that you put your attention to. And so that may kind of in some ways explain biologically this kind of seeing the world through the eyes of a child. Everything has kind of new meaning or significance. SSRIs, so I just want to again preface that I'm a psychologist and not a medical doctor, and I don't want to be speaking out of my scope of practice.
We'll put the legal disclaimer in the show notes.
Okay. Well, SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And so what they do is the mechanism is that they allow for more serotonin in the synaptic gap, because the serotonin that's being released is not being taking back into the neuron, I guess, preceding it. But with psychedelic, the serotonergic psychedelics, the mechanism is different. They're not necessarily blocking reuptake. I believe that they are just because they look very, now this is maybe, I might be wrong here, but I think it's because they resemble serotonin molecularly. They're actually being, the compounds themselves are being taken up into the neurons. This is where my neuroscience is a little bit weak, so forgive me there. But it's definitely a different action that's happening in the neurons. Maybe one thing I could say about SSRIs, though, and this is kind of very preliminary evidence, but what people often are, well, one, harm reduction. Be careful about combining SSRIs and serotonergic psychedelics, because there could be a risk of something called serotonin syndrome. Mm-hmm. But what we've also been observing in the studies, I don't think this is published yet, it seems like that even when people are off the SSRIs, and if you're participating in the research, we titrate you off of your medication to avoid the combined effect. But what we are beginning to maybe see is that for people who've taken SSRIs for a long time, for say many years, and then stop, even when the titration is okay, they tend to respond to a less intense degree to MDMA. And we're not exactly sure why. There's now kind of new research talking about how SSRIs affect the brain in a long-term way. It's not that they don't experience any benefit with the MDMA, but they tend to not have the same kind of robust of an effect. So that's a little kind of disclaimer right now about SSRIs.
Interesting.
So yeah. I'm going to extrapolate that for our audiences. Don't take SSRIs.
Well,
I'm not. No, I know that you're not saying that. I'm saying that. It's kind of funny. As I remember at one point, I was seeing a therapist, and they had talked about that, and I remember asking a very scientific question of like, well, how does it work? And the response that I got from the physician at that point was, well, we think, and that's a scary proposition when we start talking about pharmacological intervention with your brain. I mean, like, it's different if it's, I'm taking an Advil for inflammatory response purposes, but long-term effects of these seem to be, without the proper research, seem to be a scary proposition. And one of the things that we talk about, and this kind of comes back to this mechanism of action, is biooptimization and longevity. If we're supposed to live, or if we're hoping to live beyond the typical U.S. life expectancy, there seems to be this idea that we need to almost have a cognitive reset every now and then. And I think of Grumpy Old Men as a perfect example, one of my favorite movies. But you get to a point where our brains become so inflexible, so rigid, so patterned, that anything that deviates from that pattern makes us grumpy old men. And so I've always liked this idea that psychedelics have this opportunity to be somewhat of a cognitive reset, where we can, strip away the ego, we can strip away some of those patterns that make us, so rigid. And I guess I want to talk a little bit about that. Is if we were to look at a therapy intervention for psychedelics, Is there a space for the person who's really looking for longevity to incorporate these in maybe like an annual or biannual basis for something outside of depression or anxiety or things like that?
So one thing I was just wrapping up around SSRIs and how they can be helpful for some people, and then I was transitioning into, how traditional psychopharmacology is kind of different in its way it works from psychedelics, in the sense that what traditional psychopharmacology tends to do is to kind of blunt symptoms, whereas what we might be seeing with psychedelics in some cases is actually kind of going into and maybe even bringing up some of the difficult stuff that contributes to symptoms. And so, so maybe let's see where to go from here.
So almost
Well,
like it's not a band-aid effect, which the SSRIs might be more of a band-aid effect than these psychedelics.
yes, I mean, I hesitate a little bit because I want to agree with you, and I want to also be cautious as somebody who's working in a study under the FDA to not sort of make claims that we don't know. But I think that's how people like to think about psychedelics, that the phrase people say is that maybe it goes to the root of something rather than just sort of putting a Band-Aid on something. And in that way, it's interesting as a question, because you had, Evan, you had mentioned kind of this critique of SSRIs, and often psychedelics are thought of as not a first line treatment, but a later treatment. Sort of like, let's see if these other things work, and then like the psychedelics are left last. Understandably, it comes from a history of a lot of controversy and potential perceived risk. And so the idea is, let's not do something risky unless it's the very last thing. And that's why you might see studies with treatment-resistant PTSD or anxiety in people who have a terminal diagnosis, right? Because we're kind of working at the outer edges, and now we're kind of looking and going into more of the middle. And so the reason why it might be potentially, again, if all the science pans out, of good first-line treatment is because people are receiving these compounds 1, 2, or 3 times, rather than something that they're taking on a daily basis, like an SSRI, which comes back to your point around optimization, right, in the body, right? Do we want to optimize our health, we want to optimize our mental health, but I think we want to do that in a way which isn't making us, I don't want to say dependent, but bringing an exogenous, some sort of chemical or something that's outside of ourselves, and continuing to reintroduce it into our body will adapt to that external source or drug. And so I think we want to be really careful around that. And so in that way, maybe psychedelics could be really helpful because they don't do that as much. Your last question was around, I think what you were asking about was, what about kind of psychedelics is helpful for people who are well, people who don't necessarily meet the criteria for a DSM diagnosis. And I think that that's kind of maybe the research that we'll be anticipating in the future, right? Because, well, I think whether you meet criteria for the DSM diagnosis or not, people are under a lot of stress. People are often maybe not clinically depressed, but particularly during these times of COVID, it's extremely stressful in people's lives. And just like going to an intensive meditation retreat or another kind of practice, which helps people optimize their wellness, maybe psychedelics will be there one day in the future. And what we see is that generally there are definitely people who are advocating for such things around microdosing for creativity or for mindfulness. There are definitely, anecdotally, people talk about the benefits. The research isn't quite there yet, although there are research studies looking at, published already, looking at psychedelics in people who have an intense meditation practice. There are some past studies looking at creativity. So there are some, healthy individuals who are volunteers looking at how MDMA impacts a sense of social connection, a sense of well-being. So
Social
the preliminary
what's
evidence.
that?
Yeah, right.
And these days, who knows anymore?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, I think that there's definitely a possible future there, but right now we're looking at the medical potential.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you did bring up was that these psychedelics being used as a last line of defense against some of these things. Now, how is that going to impact your research if someone has been on these SSRIs to treat PTSD, depression, and then from what you're seeing is that you're titrating them down, but there is a lack or a diminished efficacy of psychedelics? Are you starting to see that in the research, and then how do you account for that when you're recruiting? You have your SSRI group as well as your non-SSRI group.
Yes. Well, so that statement that I made about SSRIs in particular comes from research. So it's not just something that I'm saying anecdotally. It's something that we've kind of quantitatively examined. I don't know if this data is published yet. And so, just the caveat being like, maybe we did something wrong in the study. Maybe there's an alternative explanation, right? With science, we always have to be open-minded around our explanation. But if it's valid that the SSRIs were responsible for what we saw, it's not that they didn't benefit. It's just they had a significant, so speaking statistically, they had a statistically significant decrease in their PTSD symptoms, but their decrease was was statistically significant and not as great as the non-SSRI group, the group that never had SSRIs. So it doesn't mean that they can't benefit, but I guess it's an area for further research. I mean, maybe there's some period of time that people have to be off of the SSRIs for some regenerative process. Maybe there's another compound out there that might be combined with the MDMA to, this is all unclear, but maybe in the future we'll figure out some more. This is, again, very cutting edge kind of information.
So when we talk about that, then one of the things that we've come to recognize, especially in looking at new and novel treatments, is that the standard of care implementation, especially in the medical community, runs about 17 years. So once something kind of goes from that FDA approval, then you've got the integration platform. And so, we're looking at potentially over a decade before this becomes standard of care. That being said, I mean, have you heard that? And then subsequently, if you guys come up with this research and we see legislative change in the immediate future, it conceivably could be a long time before we're actually starting to see this in practice therapy, right?
Yeah, big question here. Well, so one thing is that the FDA did grant breakthrough, not access. Breakthrough. It's a breakthrough designation. So there was a little bit of. So in order to get this designation, you have to be treating a disorder that is life-threatening. So in this case, it was PTSD, and that for the drug that you're studying or the treatment that you're studying to have the potential to be equal to or better than what the treatments that are available out there. And so MDMA received this for the treatment of PTSD. Psilocybin received this for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. That being said, you're right. It still takes time for this research to conclude. We are expecting MDMA phase 3 to be done sometime around 2022 or 2023, and that's when there's a review process by the FDA, and then presumably at some point around then, MDMA could be a prescribable medicine. I think the barrier. I mean, there's so much. Maybe I should also say that there's so much interest in these treatments, right? So when we're recruiting for, just as an example, when we're recruiting for participants in our research, usually a scientist who starts a new study has to put extensive amounts of effort into recruitment, right? Here we publicized that our site was open, and we had hundreds of people who wanted to participate within the matter of a few hours. So I think the demand is enormous. The question then comes to access. And I think that's the biggest challenge, not necessarily from a regulatory perspective, but how do you make this, and everybody's racking their head around this, how do you make this treatment affordable and accessible? One, you can't scale it as well as a SSRI because you can produce thousands of pills and hand them out, right? And that prescribe them. I shouldn't say hand out, but with MDMA, and with psilocybin, it's the drug therapy combination. And so then what is the problem to scale is actually the people. How do you train the therapists to at enough pace to be able to disseminate the treatment. That's where my company Fluence comes in, because we are kind of lining ourselves up to be a training site for people who are going to do these therapies. But the other barrier to access is affordability, because if you have two therapists in session with you, and you have something like, if the calculation is somewhere around something like 60 hours, like paid therapist time, you're talking about a treatment that can be costing it tens of thousands of dollars. And, you know, if it's a cure, and this is where insurance becomes really important, right? Because we don't want to make a treatment that most people can't access. That's ridiculous. Particularly people who've been traumatized or people who need it the most, can often be the people who can't afford it. And so this is where insurance comes in. And we know that economically, and this is what the United States tends not to be very good at, is comparing short-term cost and long-term cost. Short-term, yes, it's say $10,000, $20,000. But what we know about PTSD is that in terms of the healthcare economics, when it comes to the utilization of ERs for all sorts of physiological symptoms that are related and unrelated to the trauma, the expense that they cost to the system is multiple times more than the cost of this treatment. And if we are potentially curing people, economically it could make sense. But it relies on these large institutions and these systems to realize, okay, a large short-term cost to cover somebody's access to the MDMA treatment in the long run is going to save them a lot of money. But they have to be thinking in that way for that to happen. So this is definitely not a solved problem. We're encountering it now, and we're trying to figure out how we can make this accessible to people.
Well, I remember in How to Change Your Mind, they were talking about the success rate of, I think it was LSD, in getting people to quit smoking. And it was something like orders of magnitude greater than anything else that we've come up with, like 60 or 70%. So, I mean, you know, from that standpoint, the economic factors say that if you could get someone to quit smoking, what does that do for decreasing medical costs down the road after emphysema or lung cancer? All of those things, you know, kick in. So, you know, clearly there's the economic piece. One question though, where's this stuff made? So I mean, because there's also there's the insurance economics, but then pharma loves to get their hands on things like this. So is this a pharmaceutical company's wet dream, or is this because there's not a daily dose that people are like, you know, it's not that big of a deal?
One thing I just want to make a plug. So it was not LSD, it was psilocybin, and for the smoking cessation, and that's Matthew Johnson's research out of Johns Hopkins. Fantastic research. Yeah, really powerful when it comes to smoking cessation. So it's a really hard drug to stop, nicotine, smoking. To your question, well, I think you kind of said it, right? It's not a drug that a person takes on a daily basis. So pharmaceutical industries, the pharmaceutical industry, for whatever that is not really interested in this so much.
Because
they're not
potentially could be a cure.
Well, you know, this is interesting.
Those are my words, not yours.
No. Well, no. Even let's take that as let's say that it is a cure as an assumption. What I was sort of reacting to was that the question is, what is the view of the pharmaceutical industry? And I kind of take the view, maybe naively, that they maybe see what's happening, and they're definitely not getting in the way, at least not at this point. There's some people who think like, well, this is going to potentially cut into their profits. They're going to try to do something to get in the way of this research. I think that's a little bit conspiratorial, but that's not my view.
You know, just to, I come from a dietary supplement space, and I look at, you know, historically the red yeast rice levazastatin, lawsuit. And so this was probably, I believe, in the 90s, where red yeast rice became very popular at Whole Foods. And the reason that it did is because it had a natural levazastatin in it, which could help lower cholesterol. And so like so many of our pharmaceutical drugs, they're derived from natural compounds, or they're synthesized originally from natural compounds. And so once these dietary supplement companies started pitching red yeast rice as this natural compound, very similar to what we're seeing in the CBD world, as CBD is a natural constituent part of hemp, the pharmaceutical industry said, no, statins are our product. You can't claim that. They went to court, and I'll give you one guess on who won in that one. So I think as we start to look at, there is a historical trend where pharmaceuticals could say, you start encroaching on our cash cows, which, Prozac, any of, Wellbutrin, any of these as daily products covered by insurance are big cash cows for them. I don't think it's conspiratorial. I think that there's a real conversation to be had about where does pharmaceutical, fall on these psychedelics as true inventions.
Well, one place where that might happen is the insurance companies may say, well, our contracts with these pharmaceutical companies are more valuable to us. We're not going to insure your treatment because we don't want to upset the other pharmaceutical companies. So
the FDA could approve it, but then insurance won't cover it.
Right. Exactly. You could have a treatment that's difficult to access. Yeah. In terms of where the drugs come from, though, just to answer that question, it's not. There are many sort of minor contractual based pharmaceutical labs that make what's something called GMP, which is good manufacturing practice compounds. And so for phase 3 research, sort of the last stage, you need to have, say, MDMA that is in a blister pack. It meets a very, very high level of purity. Basically, that it's at the point at which it could go to market. For phase 2 research, there's a less strict process around creating the MDMA or synthesized psilocybin. So it's not like we're going to Pfizer and asking them to develop psilocybin or MDMA for us. That's not the challenge or the barrier. Although it's very expensive to develop GMP drugs because of all that goes into that process.
So I think then as we talk about that, I'd like to transition a little bit into, our listeners' understanding of psychedelics. More and more people are trying to get into this. More and more people are understanding the value of it. So how does someone who's very interested in psychedelics for true therapeutic benefit go about that? Is there a path forward in the United States, or are we subject to getting on a plane and going to Costa Rica for ayahuasca or Peru for some of these? It's that's really what it boils down to. Do people have access now, or are we waiting?
I think the answer mostly would be that we're waiting. So the exceptions being there is an interest in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and so ketamine is not a classic psychedelic. It's sometimes people refer to it as a psychedelic dissociative. It's safe. In many ways, it's safe. It's in some ways it may be even safer than the classic psychedelics. I'll compare that, but it's used in ERs all over the world. The WHO considers it to be like one of the necessary medications that every country needs to have. But there's a certain dosage level or a certain route of administration that can produce psychedelic-like effects. And there are people, and it's Schedule 3, I believe. So it can be prescribed off-label, and there are psychiatrists and therapists who are using ketamine to enhance psychotherapy, and they're saying with good effect. You may know of ketamine as a treatment for depression, and usually when people access it through a ketamine clinic, it's not with psychotherapy. It's just a very biological kind of approach, meaning that you sit there, you get an infusion of ketamine. Some people have psychedelic experiences on it. Some people just feel kind of fuzzy. And there generally is an antidepressant effect that's observed sometimes several days, sometimes for several weeks, in some rare cases, months to years. And there's research out there that has been published that looked at cognitive behavioral therapy and ketamine versus just ketamine alone, and they found that the psychotherapy helped prolong the benefits. And so that is sort of one place where psychedelic therapy is available, but we don't know if it clearly is pretty good for depression, but we don't know how effective it is for PTSD. I mean, there's some initial evidence around PTSD and OCD, but I don't think the evidence is robust enough at this moment. So that's right now what people are doing to kind of access something like psychedelic therapy, but it's a different compound and it works in a different way. Some people are electing to travel abroad. In my private practice and in the way that I educate, I really, if somebody came to me and said that they want to go to Peru to have an ayahuasca experience, I would kind of work with them to help them evaluate that decision to see if that's best for them. If they say, no, I'm definitely set on doing this, then I would help them kind of evaluate maybe the retreat that they're going to, kind of help them set their intention, kind of prepare them for what might come afterwards, and help them, again, minimize the harms and maximize the benefits. But one thing that I don't do is I don't recommend retreats. And this is sort of my kind of public service announcement here, is that there isn't really any kind of oversight over these retreats. And also, just because something like ayahuasca or psilocybin might be legal outside of this country, it doesn't necessarily make it a medical treatment in that place. And so there's all sorts of kind of risks that a person takes when they decide to do that. Again, that when they're risk benefit, maybe that's the best thing for them. But as a psychologist, I have to be careful in saying like, oh yeah, you should definitely go to so-and-so retreat. It's great. I hear, because the quality of these retreats can fluctuate over time. And again, there isn't really any oversight around it.
What's the harm? I think that we talked about the side effects of some of these. What are some of the potential downsides of psychedelic intervention?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. And it connects to what I had mentioned around how psychedelics might work differently from traditional medication, in that you kind of go into, or you kind of bring stuff up. And so if you kind of accept that hypothesis, what I tend to see a lot in my private practice are people who've been really dissociating from their feelings. Like they've had to adapt to the environment that they grew up in, and say it was a really noxious environment. Maybe there's a lot of abuse or trauma. And the way that some people cope, completely understandably, is that they kind of, just sort of push that down. So to speak metaphorically, just to like kind of not feel it. And then they can kind of get by in the world. And what psychedelics might be doing is that the healing process is partly by kind of opening up those wounds and looking at them. And when people are reaching out to me for help, usually what has happened is that they've had an intense psychedelic experience. They're feeling anxiety or having panic attacks or feeling depressed or having trouble sleeping. Those are common experiences for those people for whom this happens. What's another one? Sometimes I've had a number of people say that they've cured their depression and now they're anxious. Like they've never felt anxious in their whole life because they've just always been sort of low energy, kind of sunken down, depressed. Now they're actually feeling hopeful about the world, but maybe it's because they're future oriented and now they're anxious. Mm-hmm. So there are all of these unexpected consequences of going through this healing process. That's not about numbing, but about kind of bringing up. And not everybody is ready for that. Not everybody wants that. I think that should be on that commercial that you were talking about, right? The commercial for psychedelics. Like, on your way to getting better, you might feel a little bit worse. And that doesn't mean that you fried your brain like that egg on the, commercial. But it means that, now you're feeling all of the stuff that you've pushed down for a long time. And we're going to support you through therapy through this process. And it's unfortunate that when people sometimes hear about psychedelics as a panacea or this thing that is curative, they're often not informed about this part of it, which is the kind of the road that you kind of have to go down sometimes to get to that place of feeling better.
I think we talked about that in our ayahuasca podcast, but in my mind, it's advanced medicine. It's, you have to work to get the results. And unlike the SSRIs, and again, we're not here to bash on them, but it is more of you take that pill and the pill does the work, whereas the ayahuasca experience or psychedelic experience is like, you have to work to get the full benefit. And so that advanced element of it makes it more of I think it narrows the scope of people who are willing to do that, right? Because it is bringing up the stuff. You're having to face some of your issues. You're having to work through them. And maybe it's a great opportunity to do that in a safe place, especially with the appropriate therapist. But Yeah,
Well, I think so many people think like, okay, if I want to feel better, like what can I take to relieve myself of this pain or discomfort or emotional turmoil? When it seems like with these compounds, it's more getting to the root and bringing all this stuff to surface and dealing from it in that sense, instead of burying it down. It is more kind of surfacing, and not a lot of people want to sign up for that.
no.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's one of my concerns when it comes to the idea of, I mean, it's interesting that word prescribe, when my thinking of that word means like you are kind of, how would you put that in other language? Like you're not recommending, but you're kind of saying this is what you should do, right?
Yeah.
Whereas kind of traditionally, when I think about psychedelics, I think of it as something that people are kind of, this is a little bit woo woo, but they're called to.
Mm-hmm.
Where you have and I think that that's like, there's something valuable in that, right? That a person is seeking out this experience. They know that it might be difficult for them, but there's sort of a commitment to the process. Whereas somebody who just has some sort of diagnosis, who doesn't know about all of this and who's prescribed it, their relationship going into the experience and their expectation might be very different. And since we know about set and setting, the mindset actually is intricately connected to how the psychedelic works and the outcome that a person is going to have.
Well, and it's funny you bring that up, Ingmar, is when it came to our ayahuasca experience in Peru, we both said it's like we're called to this. It wasn't that we're gonna go have an ayahuasca in Peru. It was no. It's like we knew that what we were getting into, our experience and what led up to our experience might not have been ideal, and we probably should have talked to you beforehand. But hindsight. So before we get, but before we move on, I think one other question that I have is there's obviously there's the potential for harm based off of a person's experience or their expectation going in. There's the potential for, shall we say, some negative experience, but is there anything from a biological perspective that could be considered negative about some of these interventions?
I mean, I think aside from some of the physiological stuff around heart rate, I think we need to be careful around, this is more psychological, but it's all biological and psychological. But I think, people who, to speak vaguely or broadly maybe around this, I like to sometimes think about people who are kind of rigid and neurotic, sort of maybe like you and me. And then there's some people who are already in the world who are kind of already very open and, maybe we might think about a diagnosis of something like a psychotic like disorder, right? Where they're already kind of interpreting the world through a different lens. And it's possible, again, this is all metaphor, but by kind of opening people up further through a psychedelic experience, it's maybe more destabilizing for them. So that's one way to look at things. Recently, I don't know if there's any, this is totally anecdotal based off of my own observation, but I've had a number of people come out of particularly ayahuasca experiences describing a kind of unsettling sense of dissociation. And I know that part of this ayahuasca experience can be a sense of, even more so than with maybe psilocybin, a kind of, it's almost like a deeply meditative state where a person is kind of aware of themselves, and there's just a greater capacity for mindfulness. That's the best way I can describe it. A state of mindfulness. And I found that several people who I've worked with after ayahuasca kind of find that experience of kind of observing themselves or being kind of self-aware to be unpleasant and almost like too dissociative. And I wonder if there's something going on there biologically, maybe with the default mode network, that somehow it gets lodged in a way that they're feeling slightly dissociated after the experience. This is very anecdotal. I don't know what the evidence is for this, but that could be an effect. Biologically, let's see here.
The reason I asked
Tell me.
I had this really good friend in elementary school, and we got to high school, and he kind of went his own direction, and ended up in a little bit more counterculture type of kid. Found Pink Floyd and eventually found some LSD. And the urban myth was that he started dealing acid.
Mm.
And at one point he shows up with apparently it was on sheets. It was like a drug bust or something. The cops caught him. He shoves the sheets of acid down his pants and takes off running. And, gets a quarter mile away. All of the acid absorbs into his system. And I think that there's probably an urban legend in most places, about something like this. And then apparently he just stops and starts singing "I'm a Little Teapot" and has been somewhat vegetative ever since. So I don't know if these are the Nancy Reagan cautionary tales about some of these drugs, is that, you could do,
Meaning permanently he was changed.
messed up your brain. Everything that we saw on How to Change Your Mind, everything that we've seen in the research seems to indicate that that's not the case. But, really looking at like MDMA, ketamine, psilocybin, LSD, is there any potential for a cataclysmic shift in the brain that could cause, something more permanent that people should be aware of?
Yeah. So, I mean, generally the way that I think about this is through, so let's look there. So there's a study published, an epidemiological study looking at psychedelic use amongst the general population. And when they found that, and again, there's limitations to those kinds of study designs, but what they found was that there were no mental health deficits on a population level when it came to psychedelic use. In fact, there was a decrease in likelihood of suicidal, I believe, of suicidal ideation than in people who don't use psychedelics. Now, in terms of so what you're kind of speaking to is a psychotic break or psychotic state, right? And so
Correct, yeah.
there is, so there was a fear that psychedelics make you go crazy. So like if you take, LSD a certain amount of times, then you're going to be clinically insane or something like that. Generally, what we would then observe, if that were true, is that, again, on a population level, the rates of psychosis or schizophrenia does not is flat over many decades. It stays the same, whereas rates of different psychedelic use changes. There are trends, and sometimes it's ups and sometimes it's down. And what you would expect, if there was a correlation, well, you would expect those to be correlated. And so far, we don't see that. I think the danger is where, so we talk about a period of vulnerability for young men and young women, somewhere around the ages of 18, 17 to like, the late 20s, I think mid 30s for men. There's a window where if a person has a propensity for schizophrenia, maybe the genetic predisposition for it, or maybe it's some sort of environmental predisposition or a combination, that the psychedelic experience, due to its intensity, would be a catalyst that then contributes to the psychotic break. So the idea is that perhaps this individual would have been schizophrenic otherwise. Maybe it would have just been a different trigger, and maybe these intense psychedelic experiences are triggers for certain people who are vulnerable. And for that reason, such people who have a close relative with this diagnosis tend to be excluded from these studies because we want to be extra careful. That being said, there's some people in the psychedelic research world who are thinking about the potential for, say, MDMA as a treatment for some aspect of schizophrenia. Again, I don't know very much. It's not even, the study's not happening yet. It was a proposal. I don't know if it's going to happen. But generally, really the kind of harm reduction piece here is that if you have a history of psychosis, or if you have somebody close to you who has a history of psychosis, it's something that you should probably be very, very careful about.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you for that. I think, we hear a lot about the benefits, but, we certainly want to, as people are listening to this and contemplating, whether it's their ayahuasca experience in Peru or Costa Rica, or some type of clinical, opportunity to experience these, is, what are the pros and what are the cons? And it doesn't seem like the cons list is big, but they're still there. And, respectfully, we need to make people aware that everything there's a risk reward for everything. Absolutely.
And I'm glad you're bringing that up. And I think that maybe the biggest, so other things that stand out to me are just, well, the fact that it's black market, right? That we don't have some official way to see the quality of and whether it is what you hope it is in terms of the drug. Although test kits, there are reagent test kits that you can get off of websites like DanceSafe and others, where you can test your own drug to see what's in it. There's again a harm reduction kind of plug here, but the other concern, or just not the black market, is also the variations in set and setting, right? So there are well-meaning people who want to, say, be psychedelic therapists, or people who aren't trained in psychotherapy, who might have their own ideas of what is sort of part of the healing process who can unwittingly do harm to people. I know of a case that's really unfortunate where a person was seeking out underground psychedelic therapy, found somebody, and then that person turned out to be basically belonging to some like a cult, and was like got this person into a psychedelic state, and then was making them engage in all sort of like ritualistic, and I'm not talking about indigenous shamanism. I mean, I'm talking about kind of really weird, like, I don't know how to say this without pejoratively, but basically things that weren't honoring the person's healing process, but more about indoctrinating them into some other kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's
Ingmar, we don't have a
PG
PG rating, so if there's something you need to say,
Okay.
go for it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, it did make me really angry. I'll put it that way. And I might have
Yeah.
used some curse words with some colleagues about this. I mean, that's really sad.
Yeah.
So the lesson from that is that if you are going to buy black markets, psychedelics, is make sure you ask your drug dealer for a GMP certification.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. Show them, they need to show you the certificate. Yeah.
So to bring this back to Fluence, so what Fluence does is help educate and teach licensed professionals on, I would love for you to explain more about what Fluence does and how it helps there.
Absolutely. So one thing to just say and put it to the side is that, we hope to one day train psychedelic assisted therapists. So we want to train people to be able to give psilocybin, to give MDMA, for them to do it legally. And the reason why we're not doing that now is a little bit complicated, but basically what we would do is if we were to advertise that we're training psychedelic therapists, then they would get our training, but then they couldn't do it because there's no way to legally do that in the United States. And we only want to train people when they're actually going to be able to use what we're teaching. So that being said, what we are training right now is in something called psychedelic integration therapy. And that is and that came about because we observed that there are many people like yourselves who have psychedelic experiences, but who will go to Psychology Today or whatever website or their current therapist. They find a therapist and they say, oh, well, I did ayahuasca last week and it was the most meaningful experience of my life. Or I'm struggling with this. I realized that. And the therapist will generally give you a completely blank stare because they have no idea what you're talking about. They just don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And so that's where Fluence comes in. We want to train, we've trained over 600 medical and mental health providers about psychedelics. And so that means that these people can now be helpful in helping a person after their psychedelic experience. These professionals can help their clients, or they can help their clients prepare, or engage in motivational interviewing, or kind of dealing with the ambivalence or their excitement, or identifying contraindications. I mean, when you get into it, it's actually really beautiful and really complex. And we do this we have a 2-day workshop that we call Psychedelics 101, 102. And so people can attend that. It's open to everybody. We generally, again, want to be working with professionals because we want to replicate ourselves so other people can do this work, but we accept anybody. We just launched a certificate program, which is like a 120-hour certificate. That's a year-long process where people take reading groups. There's a consultation group. So that's where professionals, mental health therapists, they present a case and they get feedback from the group. It's a consultation. So we're just continuing to offer new kinds of courses. All of this is live. We don't do anything pre-recorded where you kind of just sit there and watch it. It's all live interaction with people who are researchers in the field. And yeah, that's, and you might know one thing that we do is we have a experiential, that's all online. The one thing that's in person is an experiential retreat at Menla, which I don't know if you know, it's like the Tibet House is a Buddhist retreat up in upstate New York. It's really amazing. Robert Thurman is I think it's his, I hope this is correct, that this is his retreat, or he's a faculty member there. And so we spend a week there engaging in contemplative practices to induce non-ordinary states. And then the therapists engage with each other around their experiences so that they can kind of have a more direct connection to this work rather than just doing it and learning about it in an arbitrary way.
Wonderful. So
Yeah.
I think we're almost out of time here, but I kind of a follow-up to that. I'm curious about how places like Berkeley or the proposed, Oregon, just decriminalizing, psilocybin and
Mm.
all of these. Does that impact your mission? Does that open you guys up for the opportunity to coach, therapists or mental health professionals to do this work prior to a federal deregulation of the Schedule One?
Yeah, I mean, I wish somebody would reach out to us to, from the state or some body for us to be able to provide that education, because I think it would reduce a ton of harm for us to kind of educate the local communities there before these legislative changes. So I think that, and there are, I mean, in October 3rd and 4th, we have a nearly sold out workshop for Psychedelics 101, 102 in Portland. And so it's very much connected to, and some of the people who are attending that workshop are connected to those efforts there. One thing that I will say, as again another PSA, is there's every situation in every city or state is very nuanced and different, and often people use the word decriminalization as a blanket term, but there's a lot of specifics to it. So, for example, ideally, decriminalization would mean that there is no criminal penalty for holding, say, psilocybin mushrooms. But what you see, and I think this is the case for Oakland, it's not necessarily decriminalized. My understanding is that it's deprioritized. So that means that the police don't have it very high on their priority list in terms of the resources that they're putting into catching people with psilocybin mushrooms. But that's different from it not being a criminal, something that's punishable, right? And so, and it also definitely decriminalized. Even if it were truly decriminalized, it doesn't make it a bona fide prescribable treatment. Mm-hmm. So people think, oh, it's decriminalized, great, I'll be able to get psilocybin therapy but no. Like that's not what it is. So please, if you are kind of following this and you're interested in it, please do pay attention to the details. I really wouldn't want anybody to get in trouble because they misinterpreted. I mean, the media doesn't do a really great job of communicating these points sometimes. Not talking to you.
No, they don't. And I think the PSA on top of that is that,
yeah.
Obviously we don't want therapists to not fully understand the context of the law and then start, offering these as interventions and then end up losing their license. So, interestingly enough, we do have a lot of medical professionals who follow our show. And I think, my PSA is, as we seem to be turning a corner on the legal side of things, where you have, Colorado, you have Oakland, whatever the legal architectural framework is about the law, the wording for these products, is our job now is to not, pardon my French, it's to not fuck it up. It's, in a lot of ways, I think, these small changes in the law are like a kid getting his parents' credit card for the first time and just going, hog wild. And so it's, it's still to follow protocols. It's still to implement, safety procedures. It's still to do things right and not just, all of a sudden make these, these municipalities regret the decision to decriminalize this because people are going nuts with, with psychedelics. So, our goal in all of this is to recognize that there is a huge potential for therapy with these and to support those efforts through Fluence, through all of the, approved and appropriate channels to make sure that this becomes a long-term benefit for people, not just a short-term, hey, that was fun, and now it's back as a Schedule One.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. I really appreciate that you saying that, and also that attitude, because it kind of happened once before. we don't want to repeat it again,
right.
Particularly with all the effort that's gone into this. But I kind of feel like maybe again I'm overly optimistic here, but I think that with the evidence that's out there right now and the direction that we're moving in, I'm really hoping that this isn't something that can't be derailed for non-scientific reasons.
And I think we're at kind of a unique opportunity in the world right now, where COVID is really taking so much of the attention on, from the FDA, from the FTC. So, I think it allows us to really conduct this research in almost a FDA vacuum. And not to say that we don't appreciate the efforts of the FDA, but they're, they're a bureaucracy. There's a little bit of an archaic structure there. So, science seems to move at a much faster clip than the FDA can keep up with. So, allowing them to focus on the COVID issues and allowing some of this research to take place, within the FDA approved guidelines, but then almost independent of them, so we can really see the benefit, I think gives us an opportunity to jump some of this stuff to the head of the class.
Yeah. It's also it's pluses and minuses, like the downside is that COVID has really made it difficult to do 8-hour in-person sessions, so no,
which of course mental health
yeah.
is like such a struggle, I think, for a lot of people right now, especially during this time. So it's almost like we need it more now than ever, but there's limitations as well. So.
Well, can you imagine how freaky it would be as if you were in like having a hallucination, you were hallucinating and then you roll over and you see someone with a mask on, that might just scare the shit out of you.
Oh, that's an actual problem that we're really struggling to deal with. That's actually totally right. Like, how do we make it so that there's still that personal connection without it being, because on these compounds, like set in a setting like that is really impactful. So we're clear masks, and we've thought about putting up a giant, like like a plexiglass wall, and all sorts of ways of working around it. But it's a challenge,
right?
Clear bubble, yeah, like Bubble Boy or something.
Yeah, but can you imagine if you'd think you were sitting next to Bane from Batman? You're like, Dr. Gorman, we are, I'm going with the honorifics again. We are out of time here. Thank you so much. I mean, there's so much that we covered, and this is a topic that's not going away. So we'd love to have you back if you've, if you're up for it, because I think that we're going to get a lot more questions on this one, and then we can really do some questions and answers from the field.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I love discussion. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
Ingmar, thank you. I think this was just super valuable for a lot of our listeners and for us too. I think I've learned a lot today. So thank you for being here with us today.
So where can people find you?
So you can visit me. Our website Fluence is www.fluence8.com. So fluence8.com. You can email me, Ingmar at fluence8.com. Happy to hear from you.
Great. And we'll put all that information in the show notes. So I'm assuming you'll get some comments and some questions on this one as far as people wanting to know a little bit more. And we can funnel we'll funnel the rest of the questions. Guys, if you have any questions, make sure to leave those, either on social, on YouTube, email, smoke signals. We answer to those on rare occasions, especially here in Northern California.
Right.
People are talking a lot to us.
They might get confused though with some of the other.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, why do you want to eat a frog? Oh no, wait, sorry. That's just the,
Amazing.
All right, guys. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of the Complete Human Podcast with your hosts,
Janna Breslin
and Evan DeMarco. Until next week, thanks for tuning in.
Bye, guys.